Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, Air Force Association's Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to our speaker series, Aerospace Nation. We're very pleased to welcome today Mr. Shawn Barnes, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition and Integration. Welcome, Shawn, and thanks for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to start off by giving you the opportunity to make a few opening remarks on the current status of the national security space enterprise, the critical challenges your team is facing, and some of your top priorities as you look into the future. So over to you, Shawn.
Well, General, thanks so much for the time today. I want to thank the Institute for all they've done and the work, not just for the U.S. Air Force, but now for the U.S. Space Force. I also would like to follow up on some of the things I've heard Dr. Roper say often, which is this sort of virtual forum, I think really is going to become the norm. The fact that we're forced into it, due to COVID is interesting. But frankly, in many, many ways, these kinds of things are much more effective, and we can reach out to a larger audience that, as you said, is going to be recorded, and we'll have a chance to take a look at this on YouTube or other venues. So thanks very much for doing this.
You bet.
I thought I'd start with, a discussion of, why is it that we're making all the changes that we've made? What has been the impetus for that? And I think people recognize this, but there's really been two kind of tectonic shifts. And the first, of course, has to do with the threat. And whether that threat is from China or Russia or potentially others, that threat is very, very real. And that threat has been growing for the last 20 years or so, but certainly in the last 10 years has gained significant momentum. And that threat is not just to our way of war, but it's also to our way of life. The adversary, if we don't change what we do today, the adversary has the potential to really deny us the benefits that we get from space for our networked communications, for our ISR, for our precision, for many other capabilities that really enable the way that we fight wars. And we can't allow that to happen. But the adversary also has the potential to take away space capabilities that frankly now underpin much of our economy. Our economy is extraordinarily efficient and effective, largely due to the kinds of capabilities that space brings. And again, whether that's the PNT systems or communications or increasingly remote sensing, all of those are things that the adversary could take away if we don't change our posture. The second tectonic shift is really an opportunity, and that's the opportunity that comes from a very rapidly growing and innovative commercial space capability. And so when I think of how important that's going to be to the economy, it's also going to be important to our ability to improve our own capabilities. So it's not that the U.S. government is any less innovative than it has been in the past, but the commercial world is becoming increasingly more innovative in space, and we need to be able to take advantage of that. So whether that's, commercial communications and data transport from LEO, or commercial remote sensing, potentially commercial weather, concepts for understanding what's going on from unattended sensors in the outback of Australia, manufacturing and resource extraction. All of those will provide not just benefits to the economy, but will also allow us to become that much more innovative within the national security apparatus as well. And so I think Congress recognized that that we were not postured to either address the threat or to take advantage of this new commercial opportunity. And so that's why they directed and OSD directed a number of changes. And I think that those changes have come about in the last couple of NDAAs, and some of it has been done internally. So, just real quickly, I think everyone knows we've stood up U.S. Space Command. We've stood up now a U.S. Space Force. There's a Space Development Agency. There will be in the not too distant future an ASD for space. And of course, there's my office, the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition and Integration. And all of those are narrowly focused on space kinds of issues. So for U.S. Space Command, they no longer are burdened by all of the other missions that U.S. Stratcom had to concern themselves with. And if you listen to what General Hyten would say, he would talk, when he was the commander of Stratcom, he would say that space was never his number one priority. Well, I can guarantee that it's going to be the commander of U.S. Space Command's number one priority. Likewise, the U.S. Space Force. General Raymond is singularly focused on organized training and equipping a force that is there to operate in space, to be able to provide capabilities to both the unified combatant commands and to the other services. SDA was stood up to largely be disruptive. And I think that that's a very positive thing, and take advantage of the way that the commercial world is changing its business practices, and to sort of get in front of that. And of course, the ASD and the ASAF were stood up to narrowly focus on space warfighting policy. And then the ASAF is the ASAF Space Acquisition and Integration. And I wanted to talk for a couple of moments about that. I find that the acquisition and integration of those two words, the integration is actually the more important of those two. I don't believe that the acquisition organizations of SMC or the Space RCO or SDA, I don't think they lack for acquisition oversight. And I certainly know that they would say that they don't lack for acquisition oversight. But I think where we really can improve is in the integration piece. And so I think that the key role, the value proposition, if you were, of the ASAF Space Acquisition and Integration is on that integration and synchronization. And those two aren't exactly the same, but they're very closely related. You know, integration is about, pulling together a bunch of disparate capabilities and people and organizations to provide a more fulsome whole. And you can certainly think of how we might be able to do that better in, let's say, the communication enterprise. There are commercial, allied, NASA and other civils, as well as multiple national security organizations that are all doing some version of space-based communication. And so are there opportunities to more closely collaborate and integrate? And I think there certainly are. So while the sum is greater than, or rather the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that's only true if you actually integrate those sums. And so I think that that's a key role. Synchronization is a little bit different. Synchronization is all about timing. And so it's how do I bring capabilities together at the same time so that we field them appropriately? One of the challenges that we've had is that the user equipment is not necessarily fielded at the same time that the space equipment is not fielded at the same time as the control capabilities. And so we've got to do a better job of synchronizing that, and synchronizing that along with the people and the organizations that will be accepting those capabilities. So if you think of some of the challenges that we've had in GPS or in the Navy MUOS program, I think there's a lot of room to improve. So not surprisingly, then, my priorities are really about standing up an organization with the appropriate responsibilities, relationships, authorities, tools, and organization to be able to address those synchronization and integration priorities. With that, let me turn it back over to you, sir.
Okay, well, listen, thanks very much, Shawn, for that context and insight. And also, thank you for all you and your team are doing to develop a more coherent approach to space acquisition and developing the world's greatest space force. Now, you mentioned at the beginning of your remarks commercial space. The space industrial base faces some significant financial challenges due to the situation we find ourselves with this COVID-19 economic turndown. We heard from Dr. Roper last week, as you mentioned, that the survey, the Space Acquisition, the Space Acquisition Council sent out recently to help identify the impacts of COVID-19 on businesses largely revealed what was expected, that the effects are deep and they're widespread. Can you go into a bit more detail on what specific insights were gleaned from the data?
Yeah, I sure can. So I took a few notes before I came down here this afternoon. It looks like about 50% of the respondents indicated that they had either a moderate or worse than moderate cash flow impact. About half have adjusted their business strategies for the next couple of years. More than a third have had schedule impacts. Over half have seen supply chain workforce impacts. Less than a third have seen supply chain material impacts. So you can see, as Dr. Roper said, it's not a surprise that those things happen, but it's certainly important for us to be able to understand.
No, thank you for that. I'm sure that's not unexpected, but it is significant, as you say. Now, the 2020 NDAA directed the Air Force Secretary to provide a report that proposed alternative acquisition processes to speed up the development and lower the cost of space systems. What was the thinking behind the 9 recommendations outlined in that report? And what are some of the biggest unanswered questions the finalized report will address, or that still need to be addressed down the road?
Yeah, thanks very much. And we're very hopeful that we'll get that report over to the Hill in short order. We're just dotting a few I's, crossing a couple of T's, making sure that we've got everything properly lined. So the approach that we took was really to take a clean sheet of paper and step back. The report is called alternate acquisition, but I would say it actually goes well beyond acquisition. It looks across acquisition and requirements and resourcing, because we believe that all 3 of those are integrally tied to capability development, and that's really where our challenges were. So we took a clean sheet approach, and I think that the sorts of reviews that we did unearthed the best practices that we found out there. Some of those best practices were with the RCO, or with the SCO, or with DARPA, or with NRO, or with MDA, or outside the Department of Defense. And that helped us understand how best to move forward. We talked to industry leaders about some of our ideas to make sure that we weren't so inwardly looking that we were gazing at our own navels. And I think we got some very good feedback. The real focus is to try to drive decision making down to the lowest practical level. And so those are the kinds of things that you see in there. It's a combination of that and managing by portfolio. And we want to do that in both the resources as well as the requirements. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. What we want to focus on is people and not process. We want to empower people, particularly program managers, to make the smart, risk-prudent decisions, but take sufficient risk that they can move forward. And we really, kept it to, less than 10 recommendations, because we wanted to focus on those things that we thought were most important. There's, 100 things that we could talk about that are challenges out there. And there's certainly some things that we didn't address in the report that we believe we need to get after. Things like, can we improve the international security cooperation process? Can we make inroads to sort of flatten the way we do our security practices to make that easier? Because those all end up being constraints on our ability to develop capabilities.
Well, speaking of most important, the report stated that its most important recommendation was the need to consolidate budget line items along mission portfolios. Could you talk to our audience about why this change is so critical, and how would you respond to those that worry that it complicates congressional oversight?
Yeah, thanks. This was one that Dr. Roper has really been a champion of. When we pulled together our recommendations initially and presented them to him, he liked them all, but he said, wow, this is the one that if we could do this, it would be a real game changer. And the reason that he believes that is based on his own experience. When he was the SCO director, he had the ability to be able to move money between programs in a way that allowed him to solve his own problems. And we're not talking about, how do I move, $1 billion, 5 years from now. We're talking about within a year of execution, how can we move money within a portfolio to be able to take care of problems that were unforeseen. And particularly, you can do that from those programs that are performing extraordinarily well. Every program has its risk management dollars. And where those programs don't need to take advantage of that, we ought to be able to make better use of those funds. And so we believe that singularly would be one of the most important things that we can do. In a perfect world, we'd have as few budget line items as we could get away with. But we also know that that's part of a discussion that we need to have with the Hill as to, what's a reasonable number to be able to manage that as a portfolio. And I think that, your question about the concern of transparency, or the concern that others might think that this is upending the way that Congress has typically done things, is one that's warranted, and it's one that we very much appreciate and want to belay their concerns. We absolutely want to be very, very transparent with Congress, not just as to how we build this process, but how we execute this process. There is no reason why we can't be as or even more transparent with the Hill, with the sorts of information that they need to be able to have insight that then gives them oversight. And if I think about, the kinds of ways that we engage today with the Hill, or frankly engage with OSD, it's very much a sort of an industrial age process, right? It's let's build this report, let's take this report over to the Hill, let's give them a briefing. Whereas in today's information environment, there's no reason why we couldn't give them habitual, routine access to information that would be available because of the way that we made it so within our IT systems.
Wow, that makes a lot of common sense. And it sounds like you might have had some time in the legislative liaison business too.
A bit.
Yeah, very good. Now, one of the things that you talked about that, in my humble opinion, is spot on is the issue of integration. And one of the core rationales for establishing the Space Force in the first place was to consolidate and better align space authorities. So what progress has been made to date toward integrating, or at least better coordinating, the portfolios of those 60-odd stakeholder organizations that each have a role in national security space? And what kind of work remains to be done in this area?
Yeah, thanks. We're really attacking that on a number of fronts. And some of that is going to be solved by some organizational change, but a lot of it is going to be solved by, the way that we continue to manage relationships. So, the stand-up of the Space Force just in and of itself is going to make a difference, right? Because it should consolidate an awful lot of the space activities that go on. And so we'll be moving the Space Development Agency and be moving key parts of Army space capabilities and Navy space capabilities under the Space Force over the next couple of years. And so that in and of itself will do some things. The sort of driving down the authorities is another one that takes out layers of organizations and people that frankly are empowered to say no. We want to empower saying yes at the lowest possible level. And so driving down those authorities. One of the things that we'd like to do is to be able to have authority to take any ACAT program and have that the milestone decision authority for that ACAT program be at less than the service acquisition executive. That doesn't mean the service acquisition executive would necessarily give all of that to a PEO, but he or she might very well do that. And that way there's less people that are involved, so less of those 60 organizations get the same sort of vote that they might have today. But part of it is also just about closer collaboration as well. And I think we're making some good headway there. So it's not a big deal to have to talk to 60 different people if all 60 people agree with your point of view. And so we're trying to get alignment before we get to the PBR cycle where we all have to kind of fight for the same pot of money. We're much better served if, I can advocate for an SDA program and SDA can advocate for my program because we both believe in it, because it fits into an architecture that we both agree to.
Well, good luck. I mean, it's a real challenge. You make some excellent points, though, in the context of agreement, and this is going to be a challenging area, but understand the approach, and it makes good sense. Now, in a related topic, if you will, every military service, defense, and intelligence agency in the Department of Defense are critically dependent on our space enterprise. Chief of Space Operations has said that over and over and over again, and everybody recognizes it. Yet currently, the entire Space Force budget comes only from the Department of the Air Force. What steps do you believe should be taken to ensure stakeholders across the Department of Defense contribute resources that align with their actual space mission requirements that are provided by the Space Force?
Yeah, there's really a couple different ways to look at that. And the first is where will we be doing some consolidation and some closer collaboration between the services. And we've made good progress there. We're already taking the Navy MUOS program and the follow-on to Navy MUOS program and moving that in its entirety under the Space Force, along with all the budget that was associated with that. And that's been after a good, healthy discussion that we had well before we were going to stand up a Space Force. So that's part of what we need to do. But early on, as we looked at the challenge of standing up a Space Force, so well before it was in the NDAA, we made sure that that the Secretary of Defense understood that you can't just build the Space Force on the back of the U.S. Air Force. You'll break the U.S. Air Force if you do that. You can't just harvest all of the space professionals from the Air Force and stand it up that way. You've got to be able to take people. You've got to be able to take billets, and you've got to be able to take dollar resources, from the other services as well. Now, not surprisingly, that's not something that the other services are really interested in doing, but the Secretary of Defense, I think, has been very clear that that is the approach that we're going to take. And it doesn't mean that, everybody's going to pony up a third to get there, but I do expect that as we look at general officer billets, as we look at total billets, that those will not just come out of the Air Force. As a matter of fact, of the 1,900 billets that are put into the 5-year FIDEP, certainly not all of those have come from the United States Air Force. There was a significant number that came from other services as well. Now, moving forward, it's an interesting question of, how does the Space Force get paid for, and how do the services that are provided by the Space Force get paid for? Certainly, there's some places where a TWICF-like model makes a lot of sense, a working capital fund. And so for communication, that kind of thing makes sense, and that's the sort of thing that DISA has done in the past and will continue to be able to do. But you're not going to use a working capital fund for missile warning. We're not going to do that. So I think it's really up to the folks that own the mission to be able to spend quality time with the other service chiefs and explain to them, and the other combatant commanders, and explain to them why it is that they need a vibrant Space Force. Because absent that, they're not going to get the capabilities they need. So ideally, you want the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Chief of Naval Operations advocating strongly for the space capabilities. Again, I know you're going to wish me good luck on that, and I'll accept it.
Well, look, thanks very much for that insight. I think, in a nutshell, it kind of rolls down to the Space Force needs sufficient resources to meet the expectations, sufficient people, and then the integration piece. Back to space acquisition, much the focus on how to speed up and streamline space acquisition has been on the roles, responsibilities, and authorities of various stakeholder agencies. What can you tell us about what's being done to improve management at the program level to minimize cost overruns and schedule delays? And how much is improving space acquisition about changing what capabilities are being bought compared to how they're being bought?
Yeah, so when I look at the challenge, and I'm glad you brought this one up. It really is a perfect question. It's easy to make the excuse that we've got 60 different stakeholders that I have to go through, and that's really my problem. That is a challenge. There's no doubt about it. But frankly, any organization that does acquisition recognizes that it has a number of stakeholders. And frankly, the stakeholders involved in the F-35 program is probably 58 if it's not 60, right? So space isn't alone in that challenge.
Great point.
So I think this really does get back to something we talked about earlier, which is about driving down authority and responsibility and accountability, to the PEO and to the program manager. Providing that flexibility that we talked about at the budget line item will help us with that, because then the PEO can manage within a basket of portfolios, or rather a portfolio approach. And he can solve the problems on his own, or he or she can solve the problems on their own. Some of the work that we hope to be able to do in digital engineering is going to be able to help us with that too, because it's going to really change the physics of acquisition. It takes a long time just to get stuff done, especially when you've got to write reports that take 6 months to coordinate, that then in the end really don't necessarily add a lot of value. But the whole approach with digital engineering allows folks to get insight into a digital model, and then maybe obviates the need for all that report writing and the briefing that needs to go on. So that's taking the sort of time out of the program manager's calendar and giving it back to him where he or she can focus better. We're also looking to move the head of contracting authority into the Space Force, so there's a closer relationship between that contracting function and the program managers. And that's something we know works very, very well in the RCO. That's exactly what SOCOM does. That's exactly what the SCO does. And so there's real value to be able to do that. In terms of your question of what versus how, I think that's an important question as well. When I look at let's say the next generation OPIR system, one of the reasons that Dr. Roper is so excited about that program and how successful they're being right now is that they're really acquiring very mature technology. And they're using companies that they know can get the job done. So we're not breaking lots of new ground on this block zero capability. And so we're very confident that we can do it within the budget that we have and the time frame that we need.
That's very good. Appreciate those insights. Now, as you continue to hash out responsibilities, roles, and authorities within the Space Force, and with the increasing emphasis the U.S. is putting on the space domain writ large, our coalition partners are undoubtedly trying to figure out how they can get involved. You mentioned this a little bit earlier. Could you elaborate a bit more on what efforts you've got ongoing to coordinate coalition activities in space, such as how their capabilities fit into the space architecture, or how their launch capabilities could be used to help replenish satellite constellations, for example?
Yeah, we're doing so much work with our international partners, and there's a lot of different fora for that. The CSPO, the Combined Space Operations Forum, is one of the key ones. That one includes the Five Eyes partners and now France and Germany, with potential to expand further. And then there's a number of bilateral relationships, obviously, that we have as well. Some of those with those same partners, and then many others outside of that. And I think it starts with getting a sort of collective understanding of what the threat is and what the opportunities are, going back to my opening comments. And I think we've done a really nice job with that. At these CSPO events, the last couple that I've been to, we have spent a lot of time talking about the challenges that are out there. And I think it's really very apparent now that most of the other nations that we would normally do work with are starting to see the world in the same way. So you see France is dramatically changing the way that space is organized within the French MOD. Very similar sorts of changes being made within the UK. Australia is thinking very seriously about how they need to be able to do some reforms, and many others are as well. Japan just stood up a unit that's focused on space. And so they are starting to see the world in the same way, and that's a very, very good start. To follow that on, we've been doing some significant architecture work with them. I co-chair what's called the Capabilities Architecture Working Group within the CSPO. And we meet on a monthly basis to talk about those architecture challenges. Earlier this year in January, we met in Colorado Springs for an entire week where we went through basically obviously at the REL level, what our space architecture was going to be over the next several years. And we highlighted where we thought we were going to have capacity or capability challenges. And then each of the nations said, well, here's how I think I can contribute. There was no commitment being made then, but it was a vibrant, open discussion about how we could collaborate more closely. And those will then lead to either multilateral or bilateral agreements to cooperate on any number of important pieces, both anything from space situational awareness, space domain awareness, to space control, to communications, to launch. There's a lot of really interesting opportunities that are out there, and there's a lot of excitement within the international community to be able to do that.
And as in other domains, I think you'd agree, what you just talked about it, that we're not going to do anything alone, and that goes for operations in the space domain as well. Now, one of the goals of the Space Acquisition Council is to reach consensus on a single DoD-wide architecture for the space-based elements of missile warning. What progress has been made in translating current and planned efforts such as SBIR's Next Generation OPIR and SDA's plan for a LEO-based missile tracking constellation into a coherent concept for investment?
Yeah, we've done an awful lot of work on that, starting in the kind of mid-February timeframe. We've been meeting now regularly with MDA and SDA and within the Department of Air Force and then a few others about how to pull all that together. So when I think of architectures, I think of sort of three states of architectures. There's the as-is architecture, what exists today. There's the to-be architecture, which is just where we are today, and with the resources that are currently palmed, where will we be over the next 4 or 5 or even 10 years if we stay on that plan. And then there's the should-be architecture. Where do we really want to be? Where do we need to be? And the goal is to get from as is to should be, and not so much as is to be. Ideally, you align the to be and the should be as closely as possible. And so we've spent an awful lot of time looking at where we are today, what dollars we have and where that will lead us and where we really need to be. And so I think the work that we've done with MDA and the work we've done with SDA will be instrumental to us getting there. We've talked about, SDA has this demonstration that it wants to do in FY22. How does that play into it? How does that inform the next set of decisions? Will it be sufficiently informative that we can make those smart decisions, or does some of the other work have to go on around that, other modeling and simulation? And then we can make sure that, again, as I indicated earlier, I can advocate for the stuff that Dr. Trenier wants, and Dr. Trenier can advocate for the sorts of stuff that General Raymond wants and needs, and be pulled together into a collective architecture. General Raymond, in his U.S. Space Command role, has taken that top-level architecture and briefed it to the JROC, and was very excited about the results of that conversation.
Well, I tell you what, Shawn, as you're talking there, that reminds me of the old planning force versus programming force, where the planning force was actually what was necessary to execute the demands of the national security strategy. And the programming force was obviously what was available or provided by Congress. And the difference between the two is a risk, so that everyone can see the difference from where we are to where we need to be. So that's something you might want to consider, going back to the future and reinstituting a planning force. Now, Dr. Roper, we talked about some of the things he said recently. He mentioned last week in our conversation that a main focus of the most recent meeting of the Space Acquisition Council was about how space capabilities could potentially be designed and built centered around what he calls the holy trinity of digital engineering, agile software development, and modular open system design. What were some of your major takeaways from that discussion on how space capabilities might be acquired in the future?
Yeah, I'll tell you, that meeting was superb, and it was scheduled for an hour, and we went for an hour and 15 minutes, with some pretty senior folks, and it went by so quickly that Dr. Roper said, we need to do the next meeting on digital engineering as well. The first meeting was really to help us understand what digital engineering was all about, because quite frankly, we're not doing it in the space world today in any real way. So here were my key takeaways. First of all, it's not just a buzzword. It's actually quite real. And we got to see what the benefits of digital engineering will do, because the GBSD program manager talked to us in length about the work that he's doing. A second takeaway I had was that we in the space world have really only kind of looked down that digital engineering path. That we really need to kind of start walking down that path. And Dr. Roper has challenged us to go do that. And so the next meeting will be about what are the kinds of programs or the pieces of programs that we want to fully get after in terms of digital engineering. The third takeaway I had is that it really will fundamentally change and improve our ability to not only design, acquire, test, but also to train and operate. Because if I've got a digital representation of something that's very high fidelity, then I can basically build all my TTPs through modeling and simulation. I don't need to do that through LiveFly. It doesn't mean I wouldn't want to make sure that it actually works the way that modeling and simulation suggested, but the higher fidelity you get, the more that works. In the same way that airline pilots today are trained effectively in a simulator, and the first time that they fly a big heavy is with 300 people on board, or today probably about 112 people on board. But nonetheless, you get my point.
Yeah.
And another thing that I took away is that to get there is really going to require an investment. And it's an investment in time and learning on our part, because it's not something you're just going to pick up digital engineering for dummies and figure it out. I mean, this is something you really have to spend some time on. But it's also going to take an investment in computer processing and bandwidth, because this is a processing intensive, very, very large files that have to be moved around to be able to make this work. And finally, I would say that the takeaway that I had is that we're going to have to work with those that provide oversight and require insight, because they're not ready for this either. So the folks in OSD that we need to talk to on a regular basis, the folks on the Hill, we're going to have to explain to them not only why are we going into digital engineering, but how they can participate in that so that they can get more insight, not less.
Well, Shawn, thanks again for your comments on these critical issues. They've been very insightful. And on behalf of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and all of AFA, we wish you the very best as you continue to wrestle with these challenges that are so very, very important, not just to the military, but to every single American. Now, to our listeners, I'd like to remind you that the next event in our Mitchell Institute Aerospace Nation series is General Mike Holmes on Monday, the 22nd. General Holmes is the commander of Air Combat Command, and that promises to be a good session as well.